Previously in Hedge Knights, Lazarus and Tangier fought a scout on their way home with coal and salix trees. Madzi told Megahoof of Adlet Kingdom ruins she had found throughout her time wandering the Ryza forest. Orauco told Megahoof he intends to depart from the community next spring. Many more salix trees were transplanted to the Bison Glade and planted around the keep's boundary. Odd attackers attempted to construct weapons of war to besiege the keep. Episode 28, Slated. The community was in a state of shock that the visitors had organized enough to apparently attempt to build siege equipment in order to besiege the keep. The Adlets held a relatively well-founded belief that the visitors were little more than simple-minded raiders, unable to properly organize or strategize, relying upon looted weapons and armor for warfare. Adlet history paints a picture that the visitors who attacked during the initial invasion arrived via sky chariots, and the attackers were outfitted with weapons that were completely unrecognizable to the Adlets, and were effective beyond measure, able to topple cities in minutes. The visitors who raid the Adlets centuries later seem like pale shadows of their former selves, if the history is indeed true. Megahoof asked for a second kitchen stove and millstone. He worried that the abundance of psychoid leaves and wheat might rot before they ever were made into tea and flour. He noticed the Adlets had so much tea he thought it wouldn't be an issue if he allowed it to be consumed once again. A boon for the rest of the Glade members. Judea built a small shelf next to the research table and asked Tangier to do her a favor. Judea needed to recover from spending so much time out in the Blight constructing walls, so she asked Tangier to go fetch some of the strange devices the raiders had brought, knowing that Megahoof would undoubtedly want to examine them. This would also be a good opportunity for Tangier to help Judea in another way, by hauling slate blocks to the boundary wall to save her a future trip. Tangier spotted some steel, stacks of strange yellow packages, and also a few other metallic objects, but she couldn't tell what they were made out of or what they were for. She hauled the strange cylinders back to the shelf and intended to ask Megahoof about the yellow packages that looked like meals. Megahoof was surprised Tangier took the initiative to haul the items back to the keep and thanked her for helping despite being worried that they were still somehow dangerous. She said she had another trip to make to haul even more of the strange objects, and asked about the things that looked like meals. Megahoof said to leave it in the fields for safety, as it was doubtful visitor food was even safe to eat, and certainly not worth studying. She then asked about what was most likely steel ingots, and Megahoof told her to have her husband make sure they were indeed steel ingots before potentially using them, but to haul them in as well. She told Lazarus about the extra steel ingots, and that he'd have to analyze them and potentially melt them down and reforge them just to make sure they were indeed steel. He was excited to work with steel, but what the Adlets really needed was to decipher the way to make their own virgin steel rather than to reuse what they found. The Adlets were enjoying some quality downtime, deciding to stay mostly indoors to recover from exposure and avoid the worst of the acidic smog. The boys played tag. Dave used some spare slate to nap extra dangerous-looking arrows. Judea was fixing some of the subfloor that was damaged when the geyser chimney flooded, and Klein continued to immerse himself in the marvelous technology and knowledge that the community had uncovered from the past. A chill descended on the glade, claiming the immature wheat and Devilstrand as casualties of the arriving winter. The lost wheat didn't really matter, the stockroom shelves were brimming with it. But it was unfortunate the Devilstrand barely grew at all. Sapo and Lazarus hoped the salix trees would allow for more farmland to be cleaned, tilled, and readied for an early sowing of Devilstrand next year, giving it the best chance to mature enough for harvest. The smog had blown over, and the new boundary salix trees buffered against the blight enough to mostly spare the keep. The ill winds of smog had blighted the hill root enough the entire plot would need to be culled and replanted. Megahoof, Sappho, and Lazarus hadn't expected for medicine to be the limiting ingredient of the hybrid extract, given the historical scarcity of ambrosia, so the loss of one of 3 fields was very unfortunate. Tangier awoke and stretched her legs while arching her back, readying herself for trekking through the smoggy wasteland to haul stacks of slate and steel ingots, only to be delighted the smog had cleared. The air was crisp and dry, and the sun was particularly radiant for a late autumn. While Tangier hauled the last of the steel, Megahoof rounded up the rest of the adlets for an outing to fetch a salix tree and as much slate as the bison could hold. He thought it was important that the others knew how to properly uproot and treat salix trees, and fetching slate would be a good opportunity to demonstrate it correctly. Both Judea and Klein were under the weather with exposure symptoms, so they elected to stay behind and watch the kids while guarding the keep. The rest of the adlets weren't going far. They'd be able to easily see smoke signals in case of an emergency. Megahoof told Judea that he'd be taking them west along the southern border of the Gutrao forest and would be back in a day. Almost all of the bison were going, so the keep would be unusually quiet. Judea reminded Megahoof to pack the extract, a joke about how he had forgotten them in the past. Despite planning only to be out a day or so, such a large caravan might attract attention, so Megahoof made sure the others knew to keep a tight formation and keen eye on the horizon for any scouts like the one Lazarus and Tangier found. The group were packed and all set to depart. With most of the adlets departed, Klein took the opportunity to get to know Judea and by extension the story of the squires a bit better. He asked about how they traveled from the coast and where all their technology came from. He was particularly interested in the mineshaft, windmill, and strange crops in the farm. All were once symbols of thriving kingdoms, and yet they were found here newly constructed and planted, nestled in a polluted forest. Unlike the rest of the much younger adlets, in his many decades he had never imagined such a community able to thrive. The group searched the southern border of the forest and didn't see any other salix trees, so they turned north but managed to stay close to the keep. The sun set just as the group found a large meadow of trees and grass and decided to settle in for the night, and to pack up the slate and uproot the tree in the morning. Another benefit of sleeping outside on the frost-hardened grass was that it gave the adlets perspective on how precious their home truly was. Without sturdy stone walls and lush fields, the squires would need to return to the coast and live in overcrowded caves, eating fungus, a way of life now unimaginable to them. Tangier was still awake, and she decided to search the countryside for salix trees. She told Megahoof a tree was close by to the northeast, and she'd haul the extract so it was ready to go in the morning. She headed to sleep, and little did she know that at this moment all of the adlets were sleeping at the same time, a very rare occurrence when they're all in the keep. Fortunately, chunks of slate the right size for stone cutting were plentiful around the Catraro forest, so collecting slate would be quick and simple for the 8 adlets to manage, and no death stinger hornets were spotted either. Although Arelco knew that Megahoof wanted to demonstrate the proper technique of uprooting the tree, he wanted to sleep in a more comfortable bed instead, and decided to just get the tree treated and pack it for travel. Madzi noticed Arelco digging at the roots of the tree and rolled her eyes, and instead of helping decided to frolic in the polluted night-lit meadows, pretending they were full of flowers and butterflies, like she had seen in Megahoof's botany books. Megahoof awoke at daybreak and heard shoveling in the direction of the tree. He spotted Arelco uprooting the tree. Instead of confronting Arelco and asking him to stop so he could demonstrate the process, he decided to just let it slide and have the rest of the group gather slate so they could return home sooner than planned. Due to the weight of the tree, the adlets would only be able to return with a few dozen chunks of slate, but that would at least give the masons and stonecutters enough material to complete more sections of the boundary wall. After telling Klein all about the origins of the Hedge Squires and their little bison keep, Judea asked Klein about his childhood and time in Pennacook. He had worked as a weaver darning clothing and bedding. As he described it, it was little more than a refugee camp, barely scraping by, needing to sometimes relocate, and were constantly evading raids and patrols. Unlike the Bison Keep, Pennacook was made up of many who were either too old or too young, or just too malnourished, and as a result, the community struggled to defend itself. They lacked the strong walls of the keep, which allowed an old adlet like Klein to be effective in battle, because without them, fighting in the open fields would be far too dangerous for an elder like Klein, and he would quickly meet a grisly end. The core leadership of Pennacook were made up of several families that had intermarried over the past few generations, and he described them as both idealistic and also mostly just loyal to themselves, where they acted as if they were above the rest of the community, and it caused strife. Judea welcomed home her husband and the rest of the caravan, and then continued to listen to Klein's story. The community was about 100 strong, but every season a few refugees would breeze in, or a mercenary would decide to stay, while others would go missing or get frustrated and leave, so it was far from a stable community. As others gathered around to listen to his story, he waited until the young ones were put to bed to describe the final raid that felled Pennacook. He described how he was lucky to have been spared. He described what he heard from a distance in broad strokes to spare the gory detail. He wasn't sure if there were survivors, or even how many raiders had attacked, and just explained that hearing the mayhem was enough for him to know it was time to flee. He had no idea the raiders were tracking and stalking him through the forest, using him as bait when the search party found him, and was grateful they didn't blame him for the trap. He then asked why the search party even came in the first place, a question that just occurred to him while recalling his escape. Dave explained that he had briefly worked as a mercenary for Pennacook as well as Penobscot and Wenwinock, and convinced the other adlets to help search for possible survivors. The entire purpose of the Bison Keep was to offer refuge for those who needed it, originally founded by the squires to help with their overcrowded coastal community. But their mission expanded when the squires realized the main continent was also full of hungry and homeless refugees. Such an act of selfless generosity seemed like such a foreign concept to Klein that he offered a warning to everyone. Not all adlets were to be trusted. Some of the refugees that had breezed through Pennacook had stolen from the community and even murdered people on 1 or 2 occasions. He said that Pennacook had swindled trade partners and exiled members of its community out of spite and malice, like those who couldn't provide for the community due to illness or disabilities. Megahoof wasn't fazed by Klein's warning. Megahoof explained that Samson, a friend he had back on Hellenora, was a guard who sometimes escorted boats for scouts or messengers to the mainland, and was privy to gossip and tales about how many of the adlets on the mainland were savage and immoral. Some of it he chalked up to a way to prevent the young and reckless from wanting to explore beyond the shores, but with every tall tale there is always a grain of truth. He thanked Klein for his story and also for his candor. Not many would have offered such a warning to indebted strangers. He made sure that Klein knew that nothing was expected of him, except to make sure he did not compromise the security of the keep. Nobody was indentured, and nobody held unpaid debts. The first Nutrifungus harvest was underway, and it would allow the adlets to shift the bison's diet back to fungus. Hay kept in storage far longer than fungus, but couldn't be grown year-round, so it was best to store the hay in cases of shortage, and feed the bison as much fungus as they could. Despite having farmed the open fields in the sun, Sapo and Lazarus were still very accustomed to fungal farming in the pitch black, as they had done for years back east. The uninitiated almost felt like farmers had a sixth sense for being able to harvest so efficiently in the dark. The stonecutters and masons were back to work, trying to clear as much of the slate out of the bison pasture as they could. So much of the wall was left to be constructed. Much of it would require timber posts, bridges, and wooden walls as well, so Sapo and Lazarus would need to clear-cut the glade and hope gray pine saplings would thrive in coming seasons to replace the cut trees. Megahoof asked Klein if he knew of any adlet ruins, but Klein didn't really understand the question, or perhaps he misheard it, so he broadly gestured outwards towards the world. Megahoof stood a bit closer and clarified. He was wondering if Klein knew of any old outlet military structures, like the ones the high adlet kingdoms would have built centuries ago. Sure, Klein replied, but why? Megahoof explained that he was looking for books, tomes, and scriptures, really anything that could offer insight into technologies that were lost over centuries of monstrous occupation. Klein said that Pennacook had two libraries like that, a public one where people could exchange books, but only the sort you'd read for fun. But the three families of Pennacook also had a private library of old royal tomes. But he wasn't sure what was in them, nor was he sure they survived the raid. Other than Pennacook's library, the only ruins around Pennacook or Banalium where he'd grown up were completely ruined, and there was no chance that paper or vellum would have survived intact. Klein did his best at cutting stone, a trade of which he had very little experience. He marveled at the ridiculous abundance of wool the adlets had sheared from the bison. But given the abundant wool, the community certainly did not require him to darn clothing as his way of contributing. He asked the others about the project they were working on. He had been cutting stone just mimicking the others, hoping to be helpful, but didn't know what it was for. Arauco explained the project of the boundary wall and arboretum to keep the pollution at bay. Klein didn't really understand, but could sense that Arauco was an adlet of few words, and decided it would be best to ask someone else. Madzi and Tangier agreed it would be best to help the masons build the wall, rather than chip away underground trying to supply slate that was already in such abundance just a short trip away from the keep. Tangier asked Madzi how she felt about mining, and she bluntly said she thought mining was stupid, but it was sort of fun smacking mountains around. With toxic waste rotting around the trunks of the salix trees, it was only a matter of time until the raider corpses would start to rot and stink. Judea was the only adlet who could stomach the task, so she took a break from building to haul armor-clad monsters to the great big oven dedicated to burning away every ounce of their existence. Occasionally, she had to shovel out slag and bury it in the marsh, but otherwise they were out of sight and out of mind when she had finished. The adlets were starting to succumb to the pollution's pestilent effects, and soon they'd be sequestered again for recovery. The boundary wall was taking a toll on the community. Ironic that the purpose of the project was to help purify the keep for the health and well-being of its members. Included in the boundary wall's design was locked wooden gates to allow the adlets to freely enter and exit the glade's inner sanctum, but also to control and prevent access from marauding raiders and feral animals. After many dozens of raids, the adlets realized that most of the time raiders left even weak wooden walls alone and preferred to attack headlong towards them, even if a far better strategic alternative was presented. This anecdotal view clashed with the latest raid that attempted to use strange technology, but for the most part, simple wooden walls would suffice. The entire structure, on the other hand, was not planned to be wooden palisades, as flash storms and dry lightning were common in the glade. During a particularly restless night, Meghoof confessed to Judea he worried about the keep and the bison glade if they weren't able to further understand lost technologies. Time and time again, the squires heard stories of communities barely able to eke out survival, and eventually falling to waves of raiders. And in each story, the communities were impoverished and lacked the means to defend themselves more capably. Likely, the keep was far sturdier than the other settlements, but even the keep had been overrun by raiders and giant feral creatures, and without steel and better weapons and armor, the glade members might also fall victim. He shared with Judea that he had Madzi drawn a map of roughly where she had seen relatively intact military adlet castles, and spoke with Klein about Pennacook, and asked about books and tomes to find out it too had a library of ancient texts, but the library was likely lost during the sacking and slaughter of Pennacook. He wondered if Judea thought it was a sound idea to send a party out to search the castles that Madzi had spotted, or if it was a fool's errand. Judea told Meghoof she needed to sleep on it, and maybe he should ask the others one by one to figure out if there was a general consensus whether the risk might be worth it or not. Lily gave birth to another baby calf, and the Atlas decided to separate the patriarch and matriarch once again to make sure they had enough food to support the ever-growing herd. Often, the other members would ask the squires why they held bison in such high esteem. They were a relatively heavy burden upon the community at times, and although they were useful for hauling salix trees, the labor to keep them healthy, sheltered, and fed was a steep cost. No squire could truly answer the question. The Hilnora Adlets had been worshipping bison for so many generations, and as far as anyone could remember, they had forbidden slaughtering them for meat and leather. It was never a satisfying answer for the others, who were hungry for meat, but the only one the squires could offer. Judea wanted to celebrate the birth of the latest bison by crafting sleeping beds for her woolly friends. They had so much wool stored in the stockpile that it was honestly becoming a bit of a fire hazard. So animal beds seemed like a great way to offer the bison a small comfort. Someday they'd have a pasture all their own, but for now they'd have to settle for soft beds. Judea explained to Klein that in the past new members were offered the chance to name baby calves and told him he was welcome to name the newest calf if he wished. Klein was clearly unprepared to name the tiny animal, so Judea told him he was free to think on it as long as he wished. Judea made one extra animal bed, and she planned on staking it down adjacent to the stockpile of food offered up to the wild critters of the glade. She was curious if any of the waste rats would use it, but whether they did or not, it was the gesture that mattered to her. It was an unusually warm afternoon, and Sapo took the opportunity to start sowing replacement hillroot plants into the tilled rows. The loss of the field to blight was unfortunate and would set back the progress transplanting salix trees, but there was little Sapo and Lazarus could do until spring came around. Meghoof started asking everyone one by one how they felt about searching for lost books to unlock secrets of the past, but made sure everyone understood the likelihood of both risk and success. The squires were a bold bunch, but venturing far deeper into the rise of forest in search of ruins likely inhabited by monsters was a tall order, even for the scrappy squires. Thank you for tuning in to Hedge Knights episode 28, Slated. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help. If you would like to support me more directly, please consider joining my gaming community. A link to Discord can be found in the description of this video. A link to Patreon can be found there as well. I offer my Patreon patrons the ability to choose some of the scenarios of my series, and also have characters named after them. Thank you so very much for watching, and a special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel and made it all the way to the credits. I hope to catch you next episode. Farewell.